This is Ascension Day Sunday. We celebrate Christ's risen self ascending into heaven, going from being bound by this mortal coil, although in a resurrected body, in a resurrected state, going to become the center of all of creation, as my brother Paul Aiken said of the event. We celebrate this day. During the worship service, I did very little, indeed nothing at all, with the whole notion of Memorial Day weekend. That was somewhat intentional. I wanted us to focus on Ascension Day, but this is now my opportunity to focus us on Memorial Day. It is not a church holiday, I grant you, but it is an important one to me and to our family. That is to say, our family, especially my family of origin, going way back. My father was a Southerner, although he raised me to in the hopes I would be free of some of the racial prejudices that had been a part of his upbringing. Nevertheless, he still had pride in those Southern roots. Memorial Day began as a Southern holiday, as a Confederate Memorial Day, to remember those who died in the great unpleasantness, as they called it in Virginia, the war between the states, as they called it in other parts of the South, or the Civil War, as we who are now self-consciously Yankees tend to call it. For my father, it was a time of remembering family who had experienced the Civil War directly, that is to say, his grandparents. My great-grandfather was in the Battle of Droop Mountain, fighting for the Confederate side. It was the last battle in West Virginia. That was the ancestral home for that side of the family, the McLaughlin side. My great-grandfather was 14 years old when he was recruited to go fight on Droop Mountain, to keep the Yankees away, to keep them from seizing the railway line. He recalls that battle, his first battle, and the first of several that drove him eventually into Virginia, and I think probably farther south. But at 14 years of age, at the top of Droop Mountain, the Yankees came up that mountain, November the 6th, if I recall, 1863. He met a soldier, a Yankee soldier, who was about the same age as he was. He was carrying his gun. The Yankee was carrying his gun. Both young men faced off, and neither one wanted to be the one who fired. And so my great-grandfather laid down his gun and grabbed the Yankee gun and smashed it to bits, that is, parts of it, and threw it into the ground under a log, and picked up his own gun and continued on down the mountain, leaving the mystified Yankee behind. This story came through my grandmother, who, as a young woman, was taken by my great-grandfather up the mountain, up Droop Mountain, to the very location where this occurred, and he dug away at a place where he thought the gun might be, and indeed he found a piece of iron lying there. The remnants, he said to my grandmother, of the gun he had taken from the Yankee. That was the only story my great-grandfather ever told. He told the family that if you ever fought in a war, you would never talk about it. It was so horrible, so horrendous, the suffering, so terrible, that to tell stories as if they were stories of glory, as if you deserve some sort of credit for living through the horrors, versus those who could not tell their story. There was something wrong with that. He would have none of it. I've got a picture of my great-grandfather in his Confederate uniform. He's a big guy, my build, my size, except with a long white beard. And of course, pure projection on my part. There's a sadness in his eyes. Now, he married a woman, slightly younger, who had a recollection in her home, not so far from Appomattox, of sitting on a fence one spring day and watching a man in gray with a white horse and a long white beard riding by. He doffed his hat to her and continued on his way, and that was Robert E. Lee. These memories would cling close in our family, and so Memorial Day was a special day, a solemn day. My father would often drag me in particular, it seems, off to look at cemeteries. He went looking for Massey's, even though we were in Pennsylvania, of all places, but there was a Masseyburg there. There were Masseys in cemeteries. My father would go look and try to figure out if they were connected to us. That was how I spent Memorial Day weekends. One of the most memorable and precious was the day the entire family went to a place called Boalsburg, which had a cemetery there. I'm not sure why we went to that cemetery on Memorial Day. It was a cloudy day, as it is, sometimes Memorial Day weekend. It was a very cloudy day. And we took our basset hound along. She was a young dog. My brother had been diligently trying to train her to hunt, and she had been completely resistant to the whole notion. He had tried every strategy. I won't go into the strategies he used. Some of them were ridiculous. But on that day, in that cemetery full of people picnicking and putting flowers on graves, that dog spotted a rabbit. And that rabbit took off and went back and forth through the picnickers, chased by that dog who was baying. We'd never heard such an unearthly sound. It was absolutely hellish. But her yodeling, her screaming, and the picnickers jumping up, the food flying, with that dog running through behind the rabbit. It was the best Memorial Day I ever had, because all the ones before had been kind of quiet and sad, and all the ones thereafter were quiet and sad. No picnicking, no barbecues, nothing really terribly joyful, but this was fabulous. When I was younger in ministry on Memorial Day, I would think about the folks that I had buried. And I remember one particular one going to an old tree in a cemetery, the newer section, and there were buried a couple sets of twins. Both had died that year. It had been a very difficult year. And so I went and had a moment of sorrow and grief for those families. Not only had they lost their twins, these two families, but both couples eventually divorced. Losing a child, it can be very hard on a marriage. It was a solemn day to leave some flowers at these graves and to remember. I have been thinking about the dead, the war dead, others who have died, my parents and grandparents, and indeed great-grandparents whom I never knew. I've been thinking about, in particular, the war dead. In Christian theology, for the first 3 centuries of the church in the Roman Empire, Christians did not fight. They were to be pacifists. You were not allowed to be a soldier. But once the church won the empire, there were some allowances made. The just war theory developed. And then there became the ethical struggle over what does it mean to be a Christian soldier. And there were codes of ethics drawn up. It was always understood that to be a soldier, is to, in some way, risk your own soul. To enter into war and to kill was a challenging business from God's perspective, but nevertheless, you do what you need to do as a soldier, as a Christian soldier, in order to prevent a greater harm, for the sake of a greater love, for a calling to a higher justice. And that was the justification for being a Christian soldier within moral constraints. My own experience of working with soldiers no longer on the battlefield, and my brief foray in ROTC ended by the severity of my asthma. These experiences have made me often think about soldiers and Christian soldiers, including the ones in my family during the Second World War. And so today, for Memorial Day, I want to read some poems that often are associated appropriately with Veterans Day and with Armistice Day, which is Veterans Day as we name it now, and yet poems about the sacred death of those who gave their life not only for country, because that's not good enough reason to give your life, not for nation, but those who gave their life for the higher ideals to which we are called as a nation. Frankly, ideals which are now at risk. I think so much at risk that it's hard to give one's life, I would think, for this country now. And yet we continue to ask soldiers to do so. And so that makes it up to the rest of us, frankly, to work to have such a nation, to have such a rebirth of freedom, to so look for the angels of our better natures, paraphrasing to a degree Abraham Lincoln, that is so incumbent upon us to be citizens who hold up self-evident truths and human rights, that when soldiers die, they die for a very good reason. I want to conclude by reading to you some poems. Again, I already mentioned that, didn't I? The first one will probably be very familiar to you. The others maybe as well, but this is one I've heard before, and in fact I've read in church. I find it very moving. It is In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. The next poem is Dulce et decorum est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est patri mori. And finally, The Owl by Edward Thomas. Downhill I came, hungry, and yet not starved, cold, yet had heat within me that was proof against the north wind, tired, yet so that rest had seemed the sweetest thing under a roof. Then at the inn I had food, fire, and rest, knowing how hungry, cold, and tired was I. All of the night was quite barred out except an owl's cry, a most melancholy cry. Shaken out long and clear upon the hill, no merry note, nor cause of merriment, but one telling me plain what I escaped and others could not, that night, as in I went. And salted was my food and my repose, salted and sobered too, by the bird's voice speaking for all who lay under the stars, soldiers and poor, unable to rejoice. Friends, this is a weekend for celebration, for barbecue, for gathering with families. It's a time to have parties. But let us do so with wisdom. Let us do so with memory. Let us do so conscious that we celebrate and have parties for those who cannot, who never will again breathe the sweet air of this life. Let us do so recalling their lives, their gifts, and for some of them, the ultimate sacrifices they made in their youth. And I say again, in this uncertain time, when so much not of our lifestyles or of our wealth is threatened, although certainly that is the case, not even our health, but when so much of what we as a nation have stood for proudly, not because of our gifts, but the gifts of God, the gifts of liberty and humility and justice for all, not in fact but in aspiration, when all that is threatened with complete cynicism and dishonesty, let us remember the sacrifices of those before us and shake off the dust of false comfort. Let us rise up and be the people that we are supposed to be, the people for whom it is worth dying. To be, again, folks who create a government of the people, by the people, for the people. As an example, not only for our citizens in this country, but for the world. Let us stand up for democracy. Not because it is the best system, as Winston Churchill said, it is the worst of all systems except for all the rest. Let us stand up and make the sacrifices of others worthwhile. Amen.